So I'm much more confident talking about what the future of the PR firm will look like than I am about the future of the world. Probably also a little more confident about the future of the PR firm than I am about the future of the world, but that's a totally different topic. I do think, just to provide a little bit of context, I've been writing about the public relations industry now for 29 years, which is more than half my life, and probably more time than anybody ought to spend focusing on the PR industry. But I have a very narrow focus, and this has been primarily it. And so when I say that I have never seen the pace of change as fast as it is today, there's some historic context to that. I've been doing this a long time. And things are speeding up, things are moving quickly, and our industry is changing at a rate that if I was doing Madden's job would scare me. Because I think that what is happening right now is a very significant disruption of the established order. And when the established order is disrupted, the people who tend to feel that the most are, of course, the established leaders. And what that really means is that no matter how good you are today and how much better you think you are than your competitors, you have to keep changing, you have to keep improving, you have to keep developing new skills, you have to keep glancing over your shoulder, and really in every direction, up and down and sideways, in order to stay ahead of the trends that are engulfing us. The biggest factor in this, it seems to me, is the way in which the competitive set is changing in general. I think that 3 or 4 years ago, if I was in your position, I would be looking at my competition and I would be saying, okay, it's Genesis, or it's Perfect, or it's Integral, or it's IPAN, or it's, it's other public relations firms. Today, if I'm looking around at the competition, it's all of those people, and it's advertising agencies, because advertising agencies, I think, are coming to realize that the future is not going to be about bombarding people with your message over and over again. It's going to be engaging them in conversation. It's going to be developing real human relationships with them. It's going to be a dialogue rather than screaming. And advertising agencies are being forced to adapt and to examine what it is that we do and figure out whether they can do it the same or better. It's obviously going to be, in terms of competition, digital and social firms that came up through a different route who are now figuring out that they have to learn public relations just as quickly as public relations firms have to learn digital and social. And it's also going to be management consulting businesses, I think. Management consultants are going to understand that public relations is not just about media relations, not even just about communication. It's about policy. You guys, I think, understand this because you and I have spoken about it many times. But public relations is at its most effective when it's a policy level function rather than a communications level function. Public relations works best when it has input into how the decision is made and how a company will behave, not just what it will say about its behavior. And so that's an area that management consultants are going to look at, and in many cases think that they can do better than you can. And so the whole competitive set is changing in the agency or consulting environment. It's also changing internally. Certainly in the markets where I spend most of my time, which are the US and the UK, there is an increasing convergence between marketing and corporate communications. Marketers are coming to realize that if they want to build a strong, successful brand in this era of digital and social communications, then they have to build relationships with their consumers. They have to start to engage with them and listen to them as well as talk to them. They can't control the message anymore, they can only influence it. They have to recognize that things like the employee culture will have a huge impact on what their brand perception is. Employees today have a huge ability to influence how consumers think about a company. So employee communications is suddenly a marketer's job as well as a corporate communications job. CSR has a huge impact on how a brand is perceived, and so CSR now is a marketing job as well as a corporate communications job. At the same time, I think corporate communications people have to come to understand marketing much better. They have to realize that the value that they add is going to be perceived to a large extent in terms of how much more sales there are, because the corporate reputation gives products and services a halo. And so those two functions are coming together, and even a firm with its roots in corporate and financial is, I think, going to find going forward that a lot of its customers are CMOs rather than CCOs. They're also going to find that a lot of their customers, and I'm sure this is the case already, are CEOs and CFOs and other people with line management responsibility. And that's going to change the world fairly dramatically and dynamically. And again, it's going to be those firms that can stay ahead of that trend, that can predict it and be just a little bit further down the road in terms of their abilities and their skill sets than their clients, who are going to benefit. And so that ability to sort of predict the future, to see the future and to adapt to that future is going to be critical for any PR agency in any market. And I think the biggest aspect of that, and it's one of the things that I found very exciting when I saw Adfactors sort of year-end review documents, but also just walking around the office here. The most important aspect of staying ahead is going to be the ability to attract, develop, and retain the absolute best people. I think that there is a very clear value chain in our industry, which is, if you have great people, they will lose the mic. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking about the room and not the recording. So I won't just go back and repeat everything. We'll just have to take the second half of the presentation as it is. So, you know, as I was saying, I believe that the value chain in public relations is absolutely clear. If you attract great people, they will attract great clients. And if you have great people and great clients, you'll make money. I don't think you can do it any other way. The people have to come first, the clients have to come second, and then the money is an outcome from getting those two things right. And so the ability to bring in great people, develop those people, and keep them around and not lose them to other firms is going to be very, very important. And the most important part of this going forward is going to be to attract a new kind of people, or make sure that the people you've already attracted are learners, are people who are always prepared to almost blow up their old jobs and think about what a new job would look like. They have to be people who believe that learning is a continuous process, who are always willing to develop new skills, who are always willing to take those skills to clients and market themselves beyond the traditional paradigm of what a PR person is. And you know, I don't think we have time necessarily to talk about all the new kinds of people that you need, but there are several sort of buckets of skills that I think are going to be very important going forward. The first kind of people that we're going to need, who I don't think even existed in this business 5 years ago, is people who understand data and understand how to analyze huge amounts of data and extract from it key insights. I would go so far as to say that every PR agency today ought to have a chief data officer, ought to have somebody whose job it is to gather and analyze all the information that is out there today about your customers, your stakeholders, your messaging, and how it's being received. And the great thing about this is that I think 5 years ago, data was hard to find and expensive. And typically, the people who could afford to gather data were the ad agencies because their budgets were 5, 10 times bigger than yours. The good news now is that I think data is much more available than it ever was before. And I think that there are unique kinds of data that public relations people can gather that advertising people perhaps can't. When we talk about data, we almost, well, I almost reflexively throw the word big in front of it. So we talk about big data. We talk about, you know, all the ones and zeros that you can sort of flash across your screen. And that's important. But there's a lot of small data out there. There's a lot of intimate data out there that public relations people can get that advertising people can't. And the reason that we're uniquely well positioned to get that kind of small data is because if we're doing our jobs properly, we are immersed in our client's business on a day-to-day basis. We are interacting with opinion leaders and stakeholders every day. We're talking to employees, we're talking to consumers, we're talking to shareholders, we're talking to people in the local community, we're talking to journalists, we're talking to politicians, we're talking to everybody who makes up the organization's stakeholder. And the ability to gather information from those people and take it back inside the company, to share that information with decision makers, is something that is almost unique to public relations people. And I would argue that that sort of suggests another job that is going to be important in the future, which is what I would call, for lack of a better term, cultural anthropologist. It's one of, I think, 2 or 3 social sciences jobs that PR people need to be able to do. The ability to gather that kind of information and bring it inside the company, and the judgment and the wisdom to be able to identify out of all that information what's important, what is going to make a huge difference for your client going forward, the insight that you can draw out of that data and give to your client, on which they can build not just a PR campaign, not just a communications campaign, but a sort of multi-channel campaign that is also part of the organization's culture. And I think that that's a job that if we can deliver on it, will differentiate us and give us a position that is broader and more critical than any of the people we're competing with. So the data and insights is first. The insight development and sort of culture anthropology is second. The third thing, and it was, again, you guys are a little bit ahead of me here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is developing a real planning function. Bringing in people who have that kind of strategic planning capability that, again, has been common in advertising agencies for a long time, but is much rarer in public relations firms. Even in London and New York, very few public relations firms have a sophisticated planning capability, have people who understand how to build a sort of multi-channel strategy for communications. And in PR, this has to go beyond sort of the traditional media planning function that was part of an advertising agency. It has to be broader based, it has to be more strategic, it has to look at the quality of the audience as well as the quantity of the audience. It has to be able to identify opinion formers and not just a mass of consumers, and that's going to require a completely different skill set. We need people who are great storytellers. Not only storytellers, but story finders. One of the great things about this business is if you are as engaged with your clients as you should be, if you are as immersed in the organization as you should be, you are hearing stories every day. You're meeting with people who can tell you interesting things about the organization, interesting things about their own job, interesting stories about how they solved clients' problems. And those are the stories that you need to be telling. So we need to become story miners. This is where, you know, we used to recruit all of our people from journalism because journalists were supposedly very good at media relations. This is actually taking those journalists and giving them their old job back and saying, okay, you're now on the Infosys team. Your job is to report on Infosys. Your job is to find interesting stories about Infosys and then get out there and tell them to the rest of the world. And the other thing is, occasionally, you'll find lots of great stories. You'll find lots of positive stories. Occasionally, you'll find a negative story. Occasionally, you'll find something that's going to be a crisis when the media finds out about it. And if you do that, you can head it off before it becomes a problem. So this becomes a real, almost investigative journalist function if you're doing it right. And then, of course, once you've found those stories, you have the skill to craft them, to tell them, and you have to learn to tell them across multiple channels using multiple media. Public relations people are much better at words than they are at pictures, for the most part. And they're much better at facts than they are at emotions. We are great at telling the story and giving people the facts. We are not as great as we need to be at moving images. And I mean moving both in the sense that they flicker across your screen and in the sense that they provoke an emotional response. And we have to, first of all, get good at developing images. That means that we need to bring in people who are great at infographics. We need one of, you know, I'm working on a story right now about the PR jobs of the future. And one of the ones I keep coming back to is animation. Not because I think animation is the be-all and end-all of public relations, but because I think that is one of the jobs that encapsulates how our industry has changed. You can tell great stories through animation. And we need people who understand how to use that, and indeed video. And by the way, we have a great advantage when it comes to creating video messages, even advertising. And I know you have your roots in advertising, you have an advertising agency here in-house. I believe PR people ought to be using paid media, ought to be using paid images, and ought to be using video. And the great advantage that we have is because we don't come from this advertising mindset that says everything has to be overproduced. And this is my great example. You come to an advertising agency and you say, you know, we need a campaign to promote our new hotel. And they will send, you know, a beautiful model and her male counterpart, and they'll go and sit on a beach outside the hotel, and they'll get the director of Gravity or Interstellar to come in and put his name on the ad, and they'll shoot it all, and then they'll produce it. 9 months later, they have this wonderful 30-second commercial that looks great. If you go to a PR firm with exactly the same challenge, they'll get a couple of account executives, take them down to the water, shoot them on an iPhone, and 10 minutes later, they can put the ad on YouTube. And not only is it faster, not only is it more flexible, not only is it easier and cheaper,
it's also more authentic. It's real. It feels like something that could actually happen to a consumer. It's not just this romanticized, idealized image. And public relations people, again, if they're doing their jobs properly, understand that authenticity and credibility are the most important attributes for any campaign going forward. And so we need people who can develop all of these new kinds of content. And it's not obviously quite as simple as I just made it sound. The person who's using the iPhone or whatever needs to understand how to frame, how to edit, and all of those things, but it is a new kind of image. Then we need people who understand just how those stories are going to resonate. This brings me back to my point about behavioral science. So I think it's incredibly important for us all to recognize that the things that we have always believed will change minds are not necessarily the most effective things. I was talking earlier about public relations people understanding how to use facts and how to sort of present a factual argument. But the reality is that people aren't moved by facts. People are moved by stories. And they're moved by stories that they can identify with. I always hesitate to become political in one of these presentations, and particularly to use American politics in front of an Indian audience, but you'll bear with me if I do this. It's one of the things that Republicans understand better than Democrats. So the Democrats will typically launch a new healthcare initiative like Obamacare, and they will go out and they will give people the facts. We have 24 million people who now have healthcare coverage who didn't have it before. 97% of people were able to keep their old insurance plan. All of this is great. But then the Republicans come along and they say, this is a grandfather who, forgive me, uncle. This is an uncle who just lost his healthcare insurance and now has to pay more. And because healthcare is more expensive, he's not going to provide healthcare for all his employees anymore. And life is going to be so much more difficult for him. He'll probably cry because, you know, that's very effective. And that one story about one real person has more weight than all of the statistics and all of the numbers and all of the facts that you have on the other side. People identify with human beings and with their stories. They don't identify with facts and data. And so you have to be able to connect with people in that way. And there's wonderful social science now that tells you that if you find somebody who doesn't believe in climate change, and you present them with all the facts about climate change, it doesn't change their opinion, it reinforces it. They actually become more committed to their original position than if you hadn't said anything at all. And that's a sort of scary thought for who are in the business of changing minds. And it means that we have to learn new approaches and new ways to change minds. That sort of brings me to not a new kind of person or a new skill set that we need, but a new quality that we need as public relations people. And it may, in fact, be the most important quality for both PR people and leaders going forward, and that's empathy. It's the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand their position, even if you don't agree with it, and not say, that's irrational, not say, that's stupid, not say, all of our critics must be bad people because they're picking on a good company, but to understand where they are coming from and how they are feeling, and to frame your communications in a way that connects with them and doesn't deny them. And that's going to be incredibly important going forward. And then I think finally, the final ability that we have, which brings us full circle in terms of data and analytics, is that we have to bring in people who understand how to measure all of this. As an industry, we continue, I think, to suffer from this idea that public relations can't be measured, or that public relations people refuse to measure what they do effectively. And so I'm here today because of our SABRE Awards competition. And our SABRE Awards competition gathers what you and all of your friends in other agencies believe to be the best work in the industry around the world. And I would say that globally, maybe 10% of that work, which is the best, right? This is the stuff you are the most proud of. Maybe 10% of it is well measured. And by well measured, you know this, so I won't spend a lot of time belaboring the point, but by well measured, I don't mean we got 25 newspapers to pick up our press release. I don't mean there were 5 million people who had the opportunity to read this story. I mean, this is how many people changed their minds about an issue. This is how many people went out and bought our product. This is how many people voted for us. This is how many of our employees were more loyal and stayed with the company for longer. Business metrics, metrics that prove that what you do really adds value to the organization you work for. One of the things that I think we ought to be looking at, for just as an example, is how many of you are familiar with the idea of Net Promoter Score? Okay, so that's probably about typical. But here's one of the things that I believe very strongly, is that what we are about is trying to create for our clients more advocates. We ought to be about creating campaigns that turn people into fans of, supporters of, advocates for our clients. We want more people out there in the world saying, this is a great product, this is a great company to work for, this is a company that does the right thing. And we ought to also be making sure that we reduce the number of people out there saying the opposite. We ought to be trying to reduce the number of people out there saying this is a crappy company, this company is spoiling the environment, this company mistreats its employees, this company makes crappy products. And the result of that is the number of, we want more people who say good things about our clients. We want fewer people who say bad things about our clients. The difference between those two things is what is called Net Promoter Score. And I think almost every PR campaign can be measured on that criterion, and it's something we ought to be trying to persuade our clients is important. Not just because it's something that we are, I think, naturally good at. Okay? Any good PR campaign does that. But because it's something that advertising people are, for the most part, not even thinking about. For the last 30 years that I've been writing about public relations, people have been trying to measure what we do by criteria that were developed by ad agencies. They have been trying to measure what we do by the number of impressions, the number of views, the audience that we reached, the advertising equivalency value of what we did. I think that given where the world is today, we can turn that on its head. We can persuade clients that they should be measuring everybody, including advertising people, by criteria that we're good at. I think that engaging with people and changing their minds and turning them into advocates is much more valuable in today's world than simply hitting them over and over again with a message. And we ought to be able to persuade our clients that that's what matters. And if we do, then that initial challenge that I talked about the competitive set that we're dealing with and the changing environment that we're moving into will be an environment that favors us rather than the competition. And I think that's where we have to get to. as an agency, you guys are investing, I think, in all the right things. You've enhanced your digital capabilities over the last year or so. You have expanded so that you're looking at the entire communications universe, consumers as well as corporate and financial. You have invested in professional development, I believe, like no other firm in this market. You are sending people to management schools and business schools, not just communications schools. You are ahead, I think, of the competition. As long as you don't forget that that's a dangerous place to be, as well as a great place to be, I think the future for this agency and for our industry will be very bright indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Paul. Your words were very enlightening and an inspiration for many of us in clarifying our thoughts on the subject. Please join me in giving Paul a very big hand again. And he has to now, we are a little delayed. He has a function starting at 5. And though it's close by at Hard Rock Cafe, I will now see him off and come back. Thank you very much.